What's up, everybody? So I do a lot of technique reviews through my website. It's a service that I offer at sprintingworkouts.com, and I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the things that I look for when I'm reviewing technique so that you as an athlete or as a coach can look at video of sprinting or look at your athletes during practice and make sure that they're sprinting properly using these sort of basic ideas about sprinting. So as you watch someone sprint, one of the things we want to make sure to look for is posture. So if we take a look at posture here, we want to have a nice upright position with our spine. We want to have a neutral position with our pelvis, so that way our leg action can be nice and balanced. What we emphasize during sprinting will be frontside dominant, but the leg action itself should be balanced with some backside action and some frontside action. And that can only happen if our pelvis is neutral and our spine is in a nice upright position. We want to make sure our head is not leaned way forward or leaning way back. We want to make sure our spine is not forward, backward, and that our pelvis is not rotated excessively. If our pelvis is rotated forward too much, so we have a lot of anterior tilt, that's going to cause you to be excessively backside with your mechanics, and your whole stride cycle is going to skew to the backside. And it's also going to put a lot of stress on your hamstrings because you're going to move the attachment point that the hamstrings originate from. It's going to cause a lot of excess lengthening on the front side, and that's going to predispose you to injury. Same thing if we are posterior tilted too much. That's going to put a lot of stress on your hip flexors because you're moving that attachment point. It's going to cause you to be excessively front side and have too high of knees. You might kick out in front of the body, something like that. So we want to make sure first and foremost that our posture is upright, our head position is neutral, and our pelvis position is neutral. If someone's anterior tilted, they'll usually be kind of sticking their butt out behind them or extending in the low back too much, so you can identify it that way. If they're posterior tilting, it'll look like they're almost leaning back when they run, so you want to look out for that. So once you've identified that posture is in a good position, then we want to start thinking about having a frontside dominant leg action. It doesn't mean that our legs will not move through the backside and through the front side, that it will have a balanced movement when you look at it. But as far as, within your own head as a sprinter, what we want to emphasize is what happens basically from here till here. As sprinters, our goal is to set ourselves up with the right posture and the right, doing the right thing on the ground, coming off the ground effectively, so we can set ourselves up for a very aggressive and abrupt vertical strike into the ground. So one of the things that I think is really important to remember as sprinters is what I would call the 80-20 rule. So if we think of ground contact, and this would be time, so imagine that this is a period of time, the period of time with which we are on the ground. Here's the halfway point. 80% of the force that we produce in each stride should happen in the first half of ground contact. Only 20% of the force we produce in each stride should be produced in the back half of ground contact. But a lot of novice sprinters spend most of their time producing force in the back half of ground contact, and it skews their whole stride cycle and it messes everything up. So our goal as a sprinter is to focus on applying force very rapidly right when we hit the ground, so that we're producing that 80% of force in the first half of ground contact, and the second half of ground contact is sort of just an afterthought. It's sort of just a result of hitting the ground effectively. You will continue to produce force in the back half of ground contact, but it's not a very intentional thing. It really shouldn't be intentional at all. The only intentional thing we're doing is applying force on the front side right when we hit the ground. So we want to really be thinking about what happens from, this point to this point, not what's happening back here as far as force production is concerned. So our goal as a sprinter is to get the leg to the front side and then have a very vertically oriented, see how my foot is coming down? It's not coming forward into the ground. It's coming straight down into the ground. It looks like it's coming back because, my hips are going this way. So my foot relative to my body is going back. But relative to the ground, really the foot is just coming straight down. So we want to focus on getting the leg to the front side, striking straight down into the ground, producing a lot of vertical force because gravity's pulling us this way, and that's the largest force that we have to deal with in upright sprinting. Air resistance is very minimal unless there's a crazy wind. So the main force that we're dealing with is gravity. And the heavier you are, the more gravity is going to pull on you. So the heavier you are, the more vertical force you're going to have to produce in a very short amount of time to be able to sprint fast. So to counteract gravity, we have to strike very vertically into the ground, and that's going to allow us to produce a lot of force right when we hit the ground, so that we're within that 80-20 rule. And then the rest of the force that's produced during that stride just happens on its own. We're not intentionally producing a lot of force back here. We relax these hip extensors, And then the hip flexors can do their job to reorient the leg to the front side to set ourselves up for the next ground contact and the next ground contact. But oftentimes what happens is sprinters will be going across the ground. They'll focus on producing force by pushing backward against the ground. So now they're producing force in the back half of ground contact instead of the front half of ground contact because they're focusing on pushing backward. And because we have so little time to produce force, I mean, we have, less than 1/10 of a second to produce force while we're on the ground. If you're focusing on producing force in the back half of ground contact by pushing backward against the ground, your timing is going to get skewed to the point where you're continuing to try and use these hip extensors even as your foot's coming off the ground. So if you watch novice sprinters, out at track practice, oftentimes you'll see that when their foot comes off the ground, this leg doesn't go anywhere. If anything, it might even come, further back up off the ground, backward behind them. Why? Because they're trying to push backward against the ground. They're keeping their hip extensors turned on for too long so that their hip flexors cannot do their job to bring the leg forward. Because they're pushing horizontally against the ground and not producing a lot of vertical force right when they hit the ground, gravity's going to start pulling them down. So on the next stride, what's going to happen? That foot is going to crash forward into the ground like this. There's going to be a lot of braking forces right when that foot hits the ground, so it's going to slow you down. Once you feel those braking forces, your body's going to pause for a second and have to deal with that. Then you're going to be stuck only able to produce force in the back half of ground contact, and it's going to continue to be an issue. So you might see someone who looks like they're falling forward in their sprint at the end of a race, or maybe you feel like you're falling forward, or you feel like your legs are stuck behind you. That's a sign that you're not setting up your ground contacts effectively. You're not focusing on what happens from this point to this point. You're not focusing on attacking down very abruptly. Instead, you're focusing on this backward pushing motion. And that's not what we want to focus on as sprinters. We want to focus on getting the leg to the front side, driving that foot straight down into the ground, producing a lot of force right when we hit the ground to counteract gravity, and then we relax that leg so it can then come through very quickly, very relaxed, to the front side and set ourselves up for the next stride. So as you're sprinting or as you're watching your athletes sprint at practice, first make sure, is their posture in a good position? Are they nice and upright? They're not leaning back. They're not leaning forward. They're just in a nice upright position. Second, is our pelvis in a good position? Are we rotated forward, which is going to cause a lot of backside action? Or are we rotated backward, which is going to cause excessive frontside action? Once those things are in place, then we want to look at, is the athlete setting themselves up effectively to attack straight down into the ground? If you're producing force effectively right when you hit the ground, and then you're able to relax and let that leg come off the ground and swing through, you're going to sprint fast. You're going to have, a great chance of running fast and continuing to improve because you're working good habits. I hope this helps.